Welcome to another Barstow travel adventure, this time to the Scandinavian countries of Sweden and Norway. I'm Robbins Barstow.
And I'm Meg Barstow.
In the summer of 1982, to celebrate our 40th wedding anniversary, we decided to take a 2-week tour of these two beautiful Scandinavian countries up on the northwest coast of Europe. Shown on this map here, Norway is the country that is on the west side facing the Atlantic Ocean, and Sweden is the country on the east side of this great two-headed peninsula. On this map, the route that we followed.
We started our tour in Stockholm, the capital of Sweden, and after heading northwest into Norway to view its magnificent mountains and fjords, we had a side trip to Bergen on the coast, and we ended up in Oslo, the capital of Norway. Actually, I had flown from New York to Stockholm by myself because Robbins had been attending a meeting of the International Whaling Commission in London. We had arranged for him to meet me on the terrace outside the famous Stockholm City Hall, which faces the sailboat-dotted waterfront.
How many years had we been married? 10, 20, 30, 40. And we hadn't seen each other for 10 whole days. The Stockholm Stadshus, or City Hall, was an ideal place to start our visit to Sweden's capital city. It is a monumental brick structure in the center of which is a large open courtyard, surrounded on all 4 sides by great 3-story buildings in the form of a giant quadrangle. On one corner, facing the lake, there is a tremendous square brick tower, rising above the other connected structures to a height of over 300 feet. Protruding from the wall on one side of the tower, there is a large clock with a fascinating feature. Twice a day, a procession of gilded figures emerges on a rotating platform beneath the clock. While bells play, one can witness a representation of the legend of St. George and the Dragon, the figures traveling in a circle high above the courtyard. On another level of the tower, there is a much larger golden statue portraying the same legendary hero, St. George, in the act of slaying the dragon, symbolic of good overcoming evil. Originally opened in 1923, this unusual landmark building offers from the top of the tower a magnificent view of almost the entire city. Stockholm has been called the Venice of the North because it was built on 14 islands surrounded by waters of various rivers and lakes. Linking the old town on the right to the more modern part of the city on the left, there is now an extensive network of ancient bridges and modern highways. Ferries and riverboats provide a common form of transportation for commuters. The old central station remains the hub for railway travel over land. In the newer part of the city, there is still room for public parks and fountains, and all the bridges have separate pathways for bicyclists. The next day, we crossed over the bridge to what is known as the Old Town and spent the morning exploring the ancient streets and historic buildings in this oldest part of Stockholm, many of the structures dating back to the Middle Ages. The town of Stockholm began here around the year 1250, and for 700 years, this has been the site of the king's elaborate castles and palaces, often fought over in bloody wars. We heard a lecture about Swedish history from a guide outside the expansive royal palace of Stockholm, this present structure having been built in the 1700s. For centuries, this has been the official residence of the royal family. Security is provided by uniformed guards who from time to time parade back and forth in a traditional ritual, but otherwise remain standing motionless outside their little guard houses. Just around the corner from the palace, we visited the famous Storkyrkan, the ancient Swedish cathedral dating back to the city's earliest development in the 1300s. This church was the birthplace of the Swedish Reformation in 1523, when the gospel was preached here in the Swedish language for the first time. This exquisite lace-like spire graces another nearby church, the Riddarholm. From the heights of the island on which the old town is situated, one has a panoramic view across the river and lake to the modern-day metropolis of Stockholm. Passing a replica of a Viking ship beside a dock on the river, we went that afternoon on a boat cruise excursion up the Mälaren River, past modern suburban homes in the countryside outside the city, to visit the king's summer palace known as Drottningholm. This is a fantastic fairy tale setting built in the late 1600s in a French style reminiscent of Versailles. One of the most interesting features of this long-time royal establishment is the still used court theater, a separate building where plays and operas have been staged on behalf of Swedish royalty for over 200 years. The grounds of this Drottningholm Palace are replete with elaborate formal gardens and all kinds of pools, fountains, and statues, including this one of a giant Hercules in action. We could see why the current King of Norway and his family preferred to spend most of their time here rather than back in the old palace in the city. King Charles IV, shown in this equestrian statue, was the founder of modern Sweden. In 1814, following the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, he temporarily brought Norway under Swedish rule, and a joint kingdom continued until 1905. Since then, the two largest Scandinavian countries have remained separate and independent, each of their capital cities, Stockholm and Oslo, having its own rich history of architecture, art, and commerce. Viking Vacations was the name of the organized tour group with which we traveled during our summer of 1982 journey from Stockholm to Oslo. We were part of a group of some 24 tourists, mostly fellow Americans, riding almost all the way in a large, comfortable bus. We would enter the bus each morning after prearranged overnight stops in various hotels along our circuitous route. Everyone rotated seats each day in order to share the best viewing spots equitably. We had all assembled at the Star Hotel on the outskirts of Stockholm, and it was from here that our group departed on the morning of July 28th. Soon the bus was heading north along the relatively level middle lowlands of eastern Sweden. Our first major stopping point was the university town of Uppsala. Here we saw the hallowed halls where the famous scientist Linnaeus originated in the 1700s his still used system of classifying all plants and animals. Here, too, we were able to inspect and marvel at an ancient rune stone with the outlines of messages carved 1,000 years ago. Also located in Uppsala is the grave of Dag Hammarskjöld, one of the first Secretary Generals of the United Nations. Continuing northwest on our bus trip, we entered the lake country of Sweden with picturesque vistas around every curve. We spent our first night on the road at a lovely country inn in Rättvik, where we enjoyed a scrumptious buffet dinner and then just wandered about absorbing the peaceful sylvan view. Notice on the hillside overlooking the lake the maypole, used for costumed country dances during summer festivals. In the land of the midnight sun, the sky remains colorful even through the late hours of the evening. Stacks of hay along the way the next day gave us to know that we were coming into horse country, and of course we had to stop at the Dalarna handcraft factory where the famous brightly colored Dala wooden horses are made. These horses are individually sawed, carved, and hand-painted in a variety of sizes with brilliant colors, painstakingly applied by native artisans to each one in traditional patterns. Of course, we bought a lot of these small gift items as special Swedish souvenirs for our friends and relatives back home. Now we headed west toward Norway, but before leaving Sweden, we stopped for a group photo beside our bus. When we arrived at the border between the two countries, we were glad to see that there were no barriers, just a simple road sign marked the demarcation line. The bus did stop to pay a toll, and although there was only one toll taker, it appeared from the double toll booths that each country did collect a share of the fee. As we now proceeded under the flag of Norway, the countryside became noticeably different, more elevated and forested. The first major Norwegian town we visited was Lillehammer, later to become famous as the site of a Winter Olympics. Typically, we found new buildings mixed with old, and as always, every open establishment was decorated with flowers. As we drove gradually higher, we encountered more forests, rivers, and lakes, and our guide reminded us that this was the part of the country where the legendary Norwegian hero Peer Gynt had lived, and where he had set forth on the adventures immortalized in Henrik Ibsen's drama and Edvard Grieg's music. In fact, at our first Norwegian overnight stop in Vinstra, we visited a small church where, in the graveyard alongside it, we found a marker commemorating the local man said to have been the original inspiration for the Peer Gynt stories. It seemed appropriate, therefore, as we drove on the next day past tranquil, reflecting lakes and roaring mountain streams toward the high peaks looming in the distance, to have music from Grieg's Peer Gynt suite played over the loudspeaker on the bus. When we eventually came to the base of one of Norway's most famous mountains, Snibba, we disembarked briefly from our bus to seek close-up looks at a couple of young reindeer outside a local souvenir stand. Then came what turned out to be the single most thrilling and rewarding adventure of our entire trip, the ascent of Mount Snibba, not by foot, but by bus. The zigzag highway from the clear blue lake at its base up an endless series of hairpin turns carved out of the very side of the mountain must surely be one of the most spectacular roadways in the entire world. We had great confidence in our driver as he skillfully maneuvered our large-scale bus right along the edge of steep precipice curves with no guardrail. But as you can see from these shots taken out the window of the bus, it was not just the scenery that was breathtaking on this ride. Upon reaching the top, we congratulated the driver with much relief, and then searched for the best vantage point from which to look out over what is, without doubt, one of the most magnificently beautiful views any place on earth. Mount Snibba is 1 mile high, and the blue spear-headed body of water in the center of this scene is Geiranger Fjord. It is not a lake, but rather the tip end of a long, winding finger of ocean water from the Atlantic. What a sight for celebration. The bus trip down the mountainside was no less breathtaking than the trip up had been. But the reward of that magnificent view from the top would remain forever in the mind's eye of each member of our group. Rounding the turns, our bus was again right on the edge, but we had been blessed with beautiful, clear weather, which continued to enhance not only the safety of our drive, but the glory of our views. Perhaps Norway's most dramatic travel poster is this one showing an overhanging rock high above Geiranger Fjord. With a little extra effort on a special side trip, Meg and I were able to find this very rock, and here I am in person standing on that same spot, even though photographed from a slightly different angle. Yes, I am utterly overwhelmed and miniaturized by the setting, but it was really exciting to have our pictures taken right there at this fantastic viewpoint, which we had for so long dreamed of someday visiting. Geiranger is almost literally a picture postcard town. It is nestled at the foot of a backdrop of mountains, surrounding it on three sides like a giant horseshoe. It has a permanent population of only a few hundred people, most of whom are engaged in making tourists happy, at hotels, restaurants, shops, and in campgrounds and on cruise ships. The hotel in which we stayed had balconies outside each room, overlooking the ocean-connected water which the town faces. This bay is actually the end point of the long fjord, which, like the arm of an octopus, has followed an S-shaped course between towering cliffs for some 30 miles inland from the ocean. On the mountainside behind the town, there are tumultuous waterfalls, carrying melted snow in torrents down from the high peaks beyond, and rushing over the stream-bed rocks down into the fjord itself. Thus, the fjord is a mixture of salt water extending in from the distant ocean and cold, fresh water feeding into it from the mountain streams. Imagine being able to film this scene from your bedroom balcony. We stayed 2 nights in Geiranger. On the morning after our first night, we took a spectacular mountainside drive in our bus along what is known as Eagle's Highway. We passed one of the few old farms still surviving on one side of the mountain, and then we were treated to a series of fantastic bird's-eye views from high above the Deepwater Fjord. We could see the S-shaped course it followed between sheer cliffs on both sides. Also from this direction, we could observe in the distance the tiny town of Geiranger at the foot of the mountains at the end of the fjord. There were sheep along the roadside on our way back, the source of the wool used in making the wonderfully warm and colorful Norwegian sweaters for which this area is famous. Naturally, each of us bought a sweater to wear for the rest of the trip and then for a lifetime of winters back home. Geiranger offers perhaps the supreme example of a Norwegian fjord landscape, and just rowing a boat in this wondrous setting was a never-to-be-forgotten experience. English was spoken everywhere, but actually we found it was not too difficult to understand at least some Norwegian words. It didn't take too much imagination to comprehend these signs and to realize that utgang meant outgo or exit. Our utgang from Geiranger was by boat, but our bus went along with us. Both the bow and the stern of these large fjord ferry boats have giant jaws which open to take in all kinds of vehicles as well as passengers. When the boat leaves the dock, the jaw closes again to become the bow or stern of this two-ended drive-through cargo and cruise ship. A fjord is defined as a narrow inlet of the sea bordered by steep cliffs. Now we were experiencing an inside passage on Geiranger Fjord. On the day of our journey, there was a heavy mist obscuring the tops of the cliffs, but the sheerness of the rock walls on both sides as they curved around in a giant S was monumentally impressive. A variety of tremendous waterfalls cascaded down the cliff sides from great heights. The names they have been given, like the Seven Sisters, the Suitor, and Bridal Veil Falls, sparked our imaginations, as they must have done those of other viewers over countless centuries. This was a time for awesome contemplation, surrounded by nature's incredible wonders as our boat slowly wound its way along the 15-kilometer course to the inland transfer town of Hellesylt, where we disembarked, and resumed our touring by bus. Now it was time for mountain scenery again from the high road. At the top of a mountain pass, we paused for coffee and pastry and an incomparable view of the valleys below, where mountain reflections were mirrored in smooth lake waters, calling once more for music by Grieg. That evening we stayed at an elegant old-world hotel at Balestrand, located on another famous fjord, the Scenic Fjord. They invited us to go swimming here, so we decided to try it. We knew the water was cold, but we didn't know it would be that cold. Actually, once you got used to it, it wasn't so bad. And Meg especially enjoyed the experience of swimming in a Norwegian fjord. Before long, however, I got so cold again that I had to make another hasty exit. The next day, we went for a short cruise across the Sonja Fjord, which is Norway's largest fjord, and headed south. At the picturesque waterside town of Hopperstad, we were able to visit the famous Stave Church. This unique structure dates back to the Middle Ages and combines in its exterior ornamentation both pagan dragons and the Christian cross. Our extended side trip to the Atlantic port city of Bergen took us 2 days. Driving on a single-lane roadway alongside a fjord proved to be an adventure in itself. What happens when a bus meets a truck? Well, one of the vehicles has to back up until they come to a wider section of the highway where they can pass. On our way westward toward Bergen, not far from the coast, we encountered another roadside attraction. This was a large waterfall flowing over a high rocky ledge. Behind it was a small cave, and using a pathway along the side, one could actually get behind the waterfall and look out at the view through a window of falling water. This was an uncommon experience for most of us. Troldhaugen, just outside the city of Bergen, was the home of the great Norwegian composer Edvard Grieg. He and his wife Nina lived here for over 20 years, from 1885 to 1907, and the house is now maintained as a museum and music conservatory. In the woods overlooking the lake which the property faces, Grieg had built for himself a small hut to which he could repair for peace and quiet, and where he composed some of his later music. Bergen is Norway's most prominent seaport city, set on the North Atlantic coast at the base of 7 mountains. For over 1,000 years, it has been a center for trade and commerce, as well as being the cultural capital of Western Norway. Side by side at the waterfront date back to the Middle Ages, when the merchants and craftsmen of the Hanseatic League dominated Norwegian commerce. Norway has a long tradition of whaling, and whale meat is still available for purchase in the open market. A monument to the heroism of early Norwegian whalers stands in the Bergen city square. Today, Norway and Japan are the only 2 countries in the world still killing whales for profit. World public opinion, however, is now seeking to bring about a permanent end to all commercial whaling. Tunnels figured prominently on our return route from Bergen. Dug deep into the mountainside, they added a dramatic dimension to our drive. There were occasional side windows cut out of the rock, but it was fun to guess as we entered each gaping hole in the mountain how many seconds it would be before we saw the light at the end of the tunnel. At Stalheim, we could look down at the entrance to one of the longest tunnels going right through the middle of this mountain, and then follow the winding highway down one of Norway's finest views, the tremendous mountain-shrouded Neroidal Valley. When we reached the narrow fjord at the end of this descent, we once again boarded a large ferry and got our photo equipment ready for another marvel-filled boat trip, this one along an inland branch of the 100-mile-long Sogne Fjord. Today the weather was sharp and clear. We were intrigued to see several isolated little family farm settlements inhabited by just a few dozen people whose only connection with the outside world was by boat. The superb vistas on all sides spoke for themselves as everyone, including the birds, crowded the deck to enjoy the sights to the fullest. With soaring mountains as a backdrop, our destination this day was the small waterfront town of Flam. It's a favorite stopping point for cruise ships, large and small. Flam is famous for the incredible mountainside railway that runs up from the valley to a train juncture at the top, giving passengers some of the most eye-stretching views of any rail ride in the world. Near the summit, the train passes what may be Norway's most spectacular waterfall, the Kjasfossen. Great volumes of water cascade down the wild ravine between dark cliffs framed in green. The construction of this Flam rail line has been called a masterpiece of engineering. Myrdal, the station at the top, is half a mile high, but it takes 12 miles of back-and-forth track and 20 tunnels to reach this height here. There are several walking paths around the summit station, and Meg and I gave ourselves a double sense of appreciation for this glorious view by each taking a different path to the overlook. Still making sure, of course, that we ended up together to jointly praise God for this new high point in our lifelong journey. We hated to leave this wondrous world of water and mountain beauty, but the tour must go on. So we took off again in the bus, and after a final stop to wave goodbye to the land of the fjords, we continued on the long drive southeast to Oslo. On a towering hilltop overlooking the city, a few of us first paid a visit to the giant Holmenkollen ski jump, where the 1982 World Ski Championships were held. Can you imagine human beings going down that slope and soaring hundreds of feet through the air on skis? We took an elevator and then climbed 96 steps to the top just to get the distant view of Oslo down below. The city has an extensive waterfront where ocean-going vessels dock, and facing the water across a square is the notable twin-towered Oslo City Hall. The grounds around it have a multiplicity of sculptures celebrating the joy of human life. Most of the statues are of unabashedly nude figures glorifying the human form and family. Sculptured tributes are also found to the various kinds of laborers who constructed the large building, and carved animals, and living flowers are also honored at various fountains. This is Fridtjof Hansen, an Arctic explorer and World War I diplomat and peacemaker. On the other side of the Oslo Rådhus, or City Hall, there is an open courtyard with a unique and complex astronomical clock on the wall and a striking swan fountain. In front of the National Theatre, there's a statue of the playwright Henrik Ibsen. Along the entire length of the main street in Oslo, there is a wide public park where people of all ages constantly converge for walking, talking, standing, reading, and general open-air enjoyment. While we were in Oslo, we saw a colorful folk dance program where they performed a Swedish dance called Weaving the Wadmill, which Meg and I remembered having learned and danced together when we first met at a college conference in Northfield, Massachusetts, 42 years earlier. Our favorite exhibition and final stopping point in Oslo was the world-renowned Frogner Park, peopled by the amazing statuary of the prolific sculptor Gustav Vigeland, who died in 1943 at the age of 74. The centerpiece of this park is a monumental fountain with 6 giant men symbolically holding up the perpetually overflowing cup of life. The city of Oslo in 1921 agreed to turn this extensive area over to Vigeland and to support him and his artwork for life, and in return he agreed to give all his works to the city. In the park are over 650 human figures made of bronze, granite, and other materials. The many figures in this colossal monolith from a single block of stone seem to embody the eternal upward struggle of human existence. In a variety of settings, Vigeland portrays the multiple stages in the universal cycle of life, from birth to death. His figures are of all ages and of all times, without the surface artificiality of clothing. The emotions and actions shown in his sculptures represent experiences shared through life by all of us as elemental human beings, whether in conflict or in love. Vigeland typically used the circle as a symbol of the never-ending continuity and interconnectedness of life through marriage and family, female and male, old generation and new. In a large 7-figure bronze statue called the Wheel of Life, Meg and I found the symbolic embodiment of the unity and universality of the human experience, which it had been our privilege to share in a very special way during this Scandinavian summer of 1982. Our parting thoughts were those of our favorite hymn as we bowed in humble adoration and in our hearts proclaimed, "O God, how great thou art."
We hope you've enjoyed this Barstow travel adventure film. We'll be releasing more of Robbins Barstow's home movies on this YouTube channel during 2021. Click here to subscribe and receive the latest updates. Meanwhile, enjoy these other films by a master of home movie storytelling in the pre-digital era.